Picture this. You're standing in front of a gleaming sales office designed to look like a French palace, complete with marble columns and chandeliers that sparkle like diamonds. Inside, eager sales representatives promise you that buying an apartment here will secure your family's future, that property values only go up, that this is the safest investment you'll ever make. You hand over your life savings as a down payment for an apartment that hasn't even been built yet. 2 years later, you return to find a skeletal concrete structure, windows missing, construction cranes frozen in place like monuments to a dream that died. This isn't a scene from a dystopian novel. This is the reality that hundreds of thousands of Chinese families are living through right now. And it's just one small piece of the largest economic catastrophe to hit China since the country opened its doors to the world. Welcome to the story of China's real estate collapse, a financial earthquake so massive that it threatens not just China as economy but ripples across every corner of the global financial system. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began, to a time when China was transforming itself from an agricultural society into an economic superpower. And when one man saw an opportunity that would make him the richest person in the country. The year is 1996. China is in the midst of explosive urbanization. Millions of people are flooding from rural villages into booming cities, and the government has just made a revolutionary decision. For decades, housing in China was provided by the state as a form of welfare. You didn't buy a home, the government assigned you one through your work unit. But now, Beijing has decided to privatize urban housing, creating essentially overnight the largest real estate market the world has ever seen. Into this moment steps Hui Kayan, a former steel factory worker who had worked his way up through sheer determination and street smarts. Hui founded a company called Evergrande, and he had a brilliantly simple business model that would eventually become the blueprint for disaster. Here's how it worked. Evergrande would borrow money from banks to buy land from local governments. They would then sell apartments to buyers before a single brick was laid, collecting their money up front. With that cash in hand, they would pay back their old loans, buy more land, and repeat the cycle. It was a perpetual motion machine fueled by one key assumption, that housing prices would rise forever. And for 2 decades, that assumption held. From the mid-90s through the 2010s, Chinese property values soared. Apartments became the single most important asset for Chinese families, representing up to 70% of household wealth. Buying property wasn't just about having a place to live, it was about securing your children's future, about having something to fall back on in a country with a weak social safety net, about proving you had made it. For young men, owning an apartment became practically a prerequisite for marriage. Parents would save for decades to help their sons buy a home, knowing that without property, finding a wife would be nearly impossible. This cultural obsession with real estate created insatiable demand, and developers like Evergrande rushed to meet it. But Evergrande wasn't satisfied with just building apartments. As the money poured in, the company went on a spending spree that defied all logic. They bought a professional soccer team and paid exorbitant salaries to international players. They launched Evergrande Spring, a bottled water company, because apparently being a property developer wasn't enough. They invested billions into electric vehicle manufacturing, trying to compete with Tesla despite having zero experience in the automotive industry. They even announced plans to build theme parks across China that would rival Disneyland. These weren't strategic diversifications, these were vanity projects funded by borrowed money. The kind of excess that happens when success comes too fast and nobody dares to say no. On paper, this made perfect sense. Beijing was essentially telling developers that the days of unlimited borrowing were over, that they needed to operate like normal businesses instead of Ponzi schemes. The policy gave companies a grace period, until mid-2023, to get their houses in order. It seemed like a reasonable approach to engineer what economists call a soft landing, a gradual cool-down of an overheated market. But what Beijing didn't fully anticipate was how quickly confidence could evaporate. The 3 red lines policy was like someone suddenly announcing that the game of musical chairs would end soon. Everyone scrambled for a seat at once. Evergrande was one of the first and biggest casualties. The company had been operating right on the edge, using new borrowing to pay off old debts in a classic debt spiral. When the 3 red lines slammed the door on new financing, Evergrande's house of cards began to collapse. In summer 2021, news leaked that Evergrande had warned the Guangdong provincial government about an impending cash crisis. The company's stock price plunged. International ratings agencies downgraded their debt to junk status. Suppliers stopped delivering materials to construction sites. Workers weren't getting paid, and construction ground to a halt on projects across the country. In December 2021, Evergrande officially defaulted on offshore bond payments, becoming what some called China's Lehman Brothers moment, a reference to the American investment bank whose collapse triggered the global financial crisis of 2008. But here's where the comparison breaks down. Lehman Brothers collapsed in a matter of days. Evergrande's death has been a slow, agonizing process stretching across years. The company kept lurching along, missing deadlines, proposing restructuring plans that fell apart. all while hundreds of thousands of homebuyers waited for apartments they had paid for but would never receive. The human toll of this crisis cannot be overstated. Imagine you're a young couple in your 30s. You both work demanding jobs, saving every penny for years. You finally scrape together enough money to make a down payment on an apartment, the place where you plan to start a family, to build your life. You signed the contract, started making mortgage payments, and watched with excitement as the building went up. Then the construction stopped. The developer ran out of money. But here's the cruel twist. In China, you're still obligated to pay your mortgage even if the apartment is never completed. You're paying for a home that exists only on paper, a home you'll never live in. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is the reality for hundreds of thousands of Chinese families right now. In 2022, home buyers in multiple cities organized something unprecedented, a mortgage boycott. They collectively refused to pay their loans on unfinished properties, essentially daring the banks and government to respond. It was a desperate act by desperate people who felt they had no other recourse. The boycott sent shockwaves through the financial system because it revealed something terrifying. The social contract between the Chinese government and its people, the implicit promise that economic growth would continue and life would keep getting better, was breaking down, and Evergrande was just the beginning. The crisis spread like a contagion through the property sector. Country Garden, once China's largest developer by sales, began showing signs of distress in 2020. The company that had built its reputation on rapid expansion suddenly found itself drowning in debt, with liabilities exceeding $200 billion. Smaller developers started defaulting left and right. By 2023, more than 30 of China's top 50 property developers had defaulted on their debts. An entire industry was imploding. In January 2024, a Hong Kong court ordered Evergrande to be liquidated, marking the official end of what was once the world's most valuable real estate company. The court appointed liquidators to try to salvage whatever value remained, but the task was almost impossible. Evergrande had more than 3,000 separate legal entities spread across multiple countries, over 1,300 unfinished projects in more than 280 cities, and debt claims that were far larger than anyone had initially realized. When liquidators started going through the books, they discovered that Evergrande's actual debt load was $45 billion, nearly twice what the company had officially disclosed. And here's the kicker. Evergrande had been cooking its books for years. Chinese regulators found that the company had overstated its revenue in 2019 by 214 billion yuan, about $30 billion, and had inflated its 2020 revenue by 350 billion yuan, nearly $50 billion. They had been reporting profitability while actually losing staggering amounts of money, lying to investors, regulators, and home buyers alike. The company's auditor, PricewaterhouseCoopers, was fined $62 million for signing off on these fraudulent statements, but the consequences extended far beyond one corrupt company. By 2024, housing prices in China had fallen 35% from their peak in 2021. For a country where 70% of household wealth is tied up in real estate, this represented a catastrophic destruction of family wealth. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you a family that had saved for 20 years to buy an apartment worth 3 million yuan in 2021, by 2024, that same apartment was worth only about 2 million yuan. You hadn't done anything wrong. You had made what everyone told you was the safest investment possible. And now you had lost 1 million yuan years of savings. Just vanished. This massive loss of household wealth created what economists call a negative wealth effect. When people feel poorer, they spend less. And when Chinese consumers stopped spending, it affected not just China but the entire global economy. China is the world's second largest economy and the largest consumer of many commodities and goods. When Chinese demand drops, it's felt in factories in Germany, mines in Australia, and ports around the world. The real estate downturn has also devastated local government finances. Remember, many local governments were dependent on land sales for revenue. As property developers stopped buying land and construction froze, this crucial income stream dried up. Some local governments found themselves unable to pay salaries to public employees or maintain basic services. It created a vicious cycle. Local governments couldn't invest in infrastructure or services, which made their regions less attractive, which further depressed property values, which reduced their income even more. The impact on employment has been severe. Construction and related industries employ tens of millions of Chinese workers. When construction stops, it doesn't just affect the people on the building sites, it affects steel mills, cement factories, appliance manufacturers, furniture makers, and countless other businesses in the supply chain. Unemployment has risen particularly among young people, creating social tensions that worry Beijing. And here's the truly frightening part. We still don't know how deep this crisis goes. China's banking system is opaque, and there are concerns about how much bad debt Chinese banks are really holding. Under Chinese regulations, banks have been allowed to delay recognizing loans to developers as non-performing, basically pretending that everything is fine even when it clearly isn't. This has prevented a complete financial system meltdown, but it also means the true scale of the problem is hidden. It's like sweeping broken glass under the rug. You can't see it anymore, but it's still there, waiting to cut someone. So what is the Chinese government doing about all this? Beijing has tried multiple approaches. They've cut interest rates to make borrowing cheaper. They've reduced the reserve requirement ratio, the amount of cash banks need to keep on hand, to free up more money for lending. They've told banks to extend more credit to developers. They've relaxed some of the restrictions on home buying in many cities. Local governments have been encouraged to buy up unsold apartments to provide as affordable housing. In early 2024, the government announced a plan to provide approximately 4 trillion yuan, about $560 billion, in financing for approved housing developments. On paper, these are substantial interventions. But here's the problem. They haven't worked. At least, not yet. Consumer confidence remains shattered. Chinese families, scarred by watching their neighbors lose their life savings, aren't rushing back into the property market just because interest rates are slightly lower. They're worried about job security. They're worried about developers completing projects. They're worried that prices might fall further. And in a market driven by confidence, fear is self-fulfilling. The government faces an almost impossible dilemma. If they provide enough support to truly stabilize the property market, they risk reigniting the bubble they spent years trying to deflate. But if they don't provide enough support, the crisis will continue to drag down the entire economy. Some economists compared China's situation to Japan's lost decades. After their real estate bubble burst in the early 1990s, Japan experienced a prolonged period of economic stagnation, deflation, and low growth that lasted more than 20 years. Chinese policymakers are acutely aware of this comparison and desperate to avoid the same fate. The Japanese experience offers a cautionary tale. When Japan's bubble burst, the government's response was too slow and too small. They protected banks and big companies, essentially keeping zombie firms alive instead of allowing a painful but cleansing restructuring. The result was an economy stuck in neutral, unable to grow but not quite contracting either. China seems determined not to repeat those mistakes, but it's not clear they have better alternatives. There's also the broader question of China's economic model. For decades, China has achieved phenomenal growth through massive investment, particularly in infrastructure and real estate. But that model has run its course. You can't keep building more apartments when there's already oversupply. You can't keep adding more roads and bridges when the ones you have are underutilized. Beijing talks about shifting to a consumption-driven economy, one powered by Chinese consumers buying goods and services rather than by building things. But that transformation is incredibly difficult. It requires Chinese households to save less and spend more, which is hard when they're watching their primary savings vehicle, their homes, lose value. It requires a stronger social safety net so people feel comfortable spending rather than saving for emergencies. It requires a fundamental shift in economic culture, and cultures don't change quickly. The global implications of China's property crisis are profound and still unfolding. China has been the engine of global growth for the past 2 decades, particularly for commodity exporting countries. Australia's economy, for instance, has been heavily dependent on selling iron ore and other resources to feed China's construction boom. Brazil, Chile, and many African nations have similar dependencies. As Chinese demand for these commodities collapses, it ripples through global markets. We're also seeing the impact on global trade. With weak domestic consumption, Chinese manufacturers are exporting more aggressively, often at prices that foreign competitors claim are unfairly low. This has led to trade tensions, with the United States and Europe imposing tariffs and anti-dumping measures on Chinese goods. The Trump administration's tariffs on Chinese products, continued by subsequent administrations, reflect concerns about China dumping excess production onto global markets. It's creating a challenging environment for global trade just when the world economy faces multiple other headwinds. There's also a financial dimension. International investors who bought bonds issued by Chinese developers have been left holding essentially worthless paper. Evergrande bonds, which once traded at their face value, fell to just 1% of their original worth by early worth for global hedge funds and institutional investors who had poured billions into Chinese real estate debt. Thinking it was backed by the Chinese government, the losses have been staggering. This has made international investors more cautious about Chinese assets in general, raising the cost of capital for Chinese companies and potentially limiting China's access to global financial markets. Looking ahead, the trajectory of China's property crisis will be one of the defining economic stories of the 2020s. Some analysts believe the worst is behind us, that the massive government interventions will eventually restore stability. Others fear we're still in the early innings of a crisis that could take decades to fully resolve. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but nobody really knows. What we do know is that the days of China's double-digit growth rates, powered by a booming property sector, are over. The Chinese economy will have to find a new growth model, one based on innovation, productivity, and domestic consumption rather than on building ever more apartments and infrastructure. This transition will be painful and uncertain. For the hundreds of thousands of Chinese families stuck with unfinished apartments and outstanding mortgages, the crisis is deeply personal. It represents broken dreams, destroyed savings, and a profound loss of faith in the system. For young Chinese people who have watched their parents' generation struggle with this disaster, it's changing their outlook on life. Marriage rates are falling. Birth rates are plummeting. Not just because of China's past one-child policy, but because young people don't feel they can afford families. The social and political ramifications of these trends will echo for generations. And for Hui Keyan, the man who built Evergrande from nothing into an empire, the fall has been swift and complete. In 2023, he was placed under police control as authorities investigated suspected crimes, from being China's richest man to being detained by the government. His trajectory mirrors that of his company. It's a stark reminder that in China's unique form of capitalism, success is never truly secure. The government can take away with one hand what it gave with the other. The Evergrande liquidation process could take 20 years or longer to fully unwind, according to some estimates. With over 3,000 legal entities and assets scattered across China and beyond, it's an almost impossibly complex task. Overseas bondholders and shareholders will likely recover only pennies on the dollar, if anything at all. The primary focus has been on trying to complete at least some of the unfinished apartments, giving some homebuyers the homes they paid for. But even this limited goal seems increasingly difficult to achieve. The story of China's real estate collapse is ultimately a story about human nature, about how greed, fear, optimism, and desperation drive economic outcomes. It's about how everyone from government officials to property developers to ordinary families convinced themselves that the impossible was possible, that prices would rise forever, that the laws of economics didn't apply. It's a reminder that no boom lasts forever, no matter how transformative it seems at the time. Every bubble eventually bursts, and when it does, the people who get hurt most are usually not the ones who've created it, but ordinary people who believed what they were told and made decisions based on those beliefs. What makes China's situation particularly tragic is that for many Chinese families, buying property wasn't reckless speculation. It was the sensible thing to do, the prudent choice recommended by parents and friends and financial advisors. In a country with a weak social safety net, where pension systems are underdeveloped and healthcare is expensive, owning property was seen as essential security for old age. People weren't trying to get rich by flipping apartments, though some certainly did. They were trying to protect their families, to have something solid in an uncertain world, and that's what makes this crisis so devastating. It punished people for doing what every societal signal told them was right. As we watch this crisis continue to unfold, one question hangs over everything. Will China find a way to navigate this without triggering a broader economic catastrophe? Can Beijing engineer the soft landing that has so far proven elusive? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a longer, deeper contraction that will reshape not just China but the global economic order? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Economic systems are complex beyond anyone's ability to fully predict. There are too many variables, too many feedback loops, too many ways that policy interventions can have unintended consequences. What we can say with confidence is that the age of China's real estate-fueled growth is over. A model that worked brilliantly for 20 years has hit its natural limits. What comes next will define China's economic trajectory for decades to come. For global observers, China's property crisis is both a warning and a lesson. It demonstrates how quickly confidence can evaporate, how financial systems can become dangerously interconnected, and how difficult it is for even powerful governments to control markets once they start to spiral. It shows that there are no shortcuts to sustainable prosperity, that growth built on excessive debt eventually leads to a reckoning. And it reminds us that behind every economic statistic, every percentage point of GDP growth or housing price decline, there are real people whose lives are being transformed, often in painful ways. The elderly couple who spent their retirement savings on an apartment for their grandson that will never be completed. The young family making mortgage payments on a home they'll never live in. The construction worker who lost his job and can't find another. The local government official trying to provide services with no budget. These are the human faces of economic crisis, and their struggles will continue long after the news cameras move on to other stories. China's real estate collapse is not just a Chinese story. It's a story about the global economy, about how interconnected we all are, and about the consequences when one of the world's largest economies stumbles. It's a story that's still being written, with chapters yet to come that will surprise us in ways we can't predict. What started with a gleaming sales office that looked like a French palace and promises of secure futures has ended with empty concrete shells and broken dreams. It's a monument to hubris, to the danger of believing that any asset can only go up, and to the profound human cost when economic systems fail. And as we watch the slow-motion unwinding of the world's largest real estate bubble, we would do well to remember the lesson. In economics, as in life, What goes up must eventually come down. The only question is how hard the landing will be and who will bear the cost. For China and for the world, we're still waiting to find out.